Grandpa's will reading. Every relative was laughing at me. They all got millions of dollars. And I only got a crumpled piece of paper. But when I laid it on the table, their faces lost all color. My name is Ellie Harper. I'm 29 years old. I live in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, that has exactly one window facing a brick wall and a radiator that makes a sound like someone shaking a bag of pennies every night from October through March. I have a used car with a cracked side mirror that I keep meaning to fix. I have a job I love that doesn't pay what it should. I have a best friend named Priya who brings me soup when I'm sick and tells me the truth when I don't want to hear it. I have a small collection of things that matter to me: books, a few photographs, a coffee mug that says world's okayest everything that I bought for myself as a joke and somehow became my most used possession. And until 6 months ago, I had my grandfather. His name was Walter James Harper. He was 84 years old when he passed. He had been a quiet man his entire life. Not quiet in the way of someone who had nothing to say, but quiet in the way of someone who had decided long ago that the things worth saying deserved to be said carefully, and that most of what filled up conversations was just noise. He had big hands that were always slightly rough from the garden he kept in his backyard, even in his 80s when the doctor told him to take it easy, and he smiled and kept going out to the garden. He made coffee too strong and drank it without complaining. He read actual paper books and bent the corners of pages he wanted to find again and never apologized for it. He laughed with his whole body at things that actually deserved laughter and stayed completely still when things didn't. He was my favorite person. Not because he gave me things. He didn't, not in the way the rest of the family measured giving. He didn't pay my tuition or buy me a car or slip money into my birthday cards the way his own children, my aunts and uncles, had come to expect from him over the decades. What Grandpa Walter gave me was something harder to calculate and easier to take for granted when you're young and only fully understand once it's gone. He gave me his time, his actual attention, the specific unhurried quality of being in a room with someone who is not anywhere else in their mind. When I was 7 years old and learning to read and frustrated because the other kids in my class seemed to find it easier, Grandpa Walter sat with me every Saturday morning for 4 months and read out loud to me, not in the patient but tired way that busy adults read to children, but in the genuinely invested way of someone who was also curious about what happened next. When I was 14, and the social landscape of middle school was brutal in the particular way middle school was always brutal, he listened without offering solutions because he understood before I could say it that I didn't need solutions. I needed to be heard. When I was 22, and my first relationship ended badly in the way that first relationships ended badly, and I called him instead of my parents because my parents would have tried to fix it, and I didn't want it fixed, he said, "Well, that sounds like it really hurt, just that, and it was exactly right." He saw me. In a family that had always been better at managing appearances than actually seeing each other, my grandfather saw me. So when he passed on a Tuesday in March, and the will reading was scheduled for the following Saturday at the offices of a lawyer named Harrison Webb in downtown Columbus, I drove there not thinking about what I was going to receive. I drove there thinking about what I was going to lose, and how the room was going to feel different than every room I would sit in for the rest of my life, because the person who had always made me feel like I was supposed to be there would no longer be in it. I was not prepared for what the will reading actually turned out to be. I was not prepared for what was in my grandfather's crumpled piece of paper. And I was especially not prepared for what happened to the faces of every person in that room when I laid it on the table. If you've ever been the one in the family that everyone else looked past, the one who didn't have the expensive house or the powerful career or the perfect marriage, but who loved the hardest and stayed the longest, this story is for you. Stay with me all the way through. It gets good. I promise it gets good. Like this video right now, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best. Subscribe to this channel for stories that go places you don't expect. Ring the notification bell and let's go all the way back to the beginning. To a man named Walter James Harper, to the life he built, To the family that gathered around that life like moths around a light and never once understood what the light actually was. Walter James Harper was born in 1939 in a small town called Millbrook, Indiana, the third son of a hardware store owner named Gerald Harper and a schoolteacher named Betty who taught fourth grade for 31 years and was still remembered fondly by people who are now in their 60s and 70s for the way she explained fractions. Millbrook in the 1940s and 1950s was the kind of American small town that existed before highways bypassed it, and chain stores replaced the main street businesses, and the specific texture of a community built on knowing your neighbors gave way to the specific texture of a community built on not necessarily needing to. It had a church on every other corner, a diner where the coffee was always on, a hardware store that Gerald ran with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and the particular kind of social fabric that made everyone's business everyone else's business in ways that were both suffocating and comforting depending on what you were going through. Walter grew up working in his father's hardware store from the time he was old enough to be useful, not just fetching things from shelves. Gerald Harper believed that if you were going to be in a business, you should understand every part of it. And so by the time Walter was 14, he knew inventory management, basic accounting, supplier relationships, and the specific art of helping a customer understand what they actually needed rather than what they thought they needed, which was a skill that translated into every professional context he ever operated in. He was not a flashy young man. The flashy young men in Millbrook in the 1950s were the ones who drove fast cars and played sports and talked loudly about their plans. Walter drove a sensible truck, played no organized sports, and talked quietly about specific things he had thought carefully about. He was not uninteresting. He was the kind of interesting that required patience to find, the kind that didn't advertise itself. He met my grandmother, Eleanor, in 1961 at a church social where she had come with her cousin from 3 towns over, and where Walter, according to family legend, spent 45 minutes talking to her about the logistics of lumber supply chains before either of them realized they had been talking for 45 minutes. Eleanor had said later, and this story was told at their 50th anniversary dinner that I was 8 years old at, that she had initially thought he was the most boring man she had ever met, and then somewhere around the 45-minute mark had understood that he wasn't boring at all. He was just thoughtful in a way she had never encountered, and that was actually far more interesting than the loud fast car men she had been meeting at church socials for 3 years. They were married in 1962. My grandmother Eleanor was the warmth in their marriage, the one who remembered birthdays and made people feel welcome and organized the holiday gatherings that became the backbone of the extended family's social calendar. My grandfather was the steadiness, the practical intelligence, the one who sat quietly in the middle of whatever was happening and understood it more completely than anyone else in the room and waited to be asked. He had left Millbrook in 1963 when a job opportunity in Columbus came through a connection his father had with a manufacturing equipment company. It was not a dramatic move. Walter was not a dramatic person. He loaded their things into a truck, drove to Columbus, found a house in a neighborhood called Clintonville that had a backyard large enough for the garden he had already decided he was going to plant, and got to work. He spent 31 years at Meridian Manufacturing Equipment as a regional sales and operations coordinator, which is a title that communicates very little about what he actually did, which was essentially serve as the operational intelligence of the regional office. He was the one who understood how the numbers connected to the reality on the ground. He was the one the salespeople came to when a deal had complications that required actual problem solving rather than smooth talking. He was the one who stayed late when a client had an issue that couldn't wait and came in early when something needed to be done before business hours and never made a production of either. He was not promoted into executive leadership. This was a fact that his own children, my Aunt Patricia and Uncle Douglas and Uncle Richard, had always presented as a failure of some kind, a sign that their father had not been ambitious enough or political enough or aware enough of how careers worked. What they had not understood, and what I understood only later by paying attention, was that my grandfather had made a deliberate choice. Not once, but many times. He had been offered management positions. He had turned them down, not because he lacked the ability, but because he had looked carefully at what those positions actually required, the politics, the performance, the distance from the work itself, and had decided that what he valued was not the title but the work. He was, by the time he retired in 1994, one of the most respected figures in his industry at the regional level. Not famous, respected. The specific, quiet respect that accumulates over 3 decades of doing things correctly without needing anyone to make a production of it. He also, in those 31 years, had been investing. This is the part the family didn't fully know, not because he hid it from them in a dramatic sense, because he never made a production of it and they never asked the right questions. Walter Harper had started investing in 1965, 2 years after he arrived in Columbus, with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything else. He did not invest in things he didn't understand. He did not chase trends or hot tips or the particular excitement of a get-rich-fast opportunity. He invested slowly and consistently and patiently in things he understood and held them for long periods and reinvested the returns, and did this year after year for 58 years, without telling anyone what the numbers actually looked like. He paid for his children's education. He maintained the Clintonville house. He drove sensible cars. He wore clothes until they wore out. He kept the garden. He made coffee too strong and drank it without complaining. And quietly, over 58 years of patient, consistent, informed investing, Walter James Harper had built something that absolutely nobody in the family, except his lawyer Harrison Webb, had any idea about. Now let me tell you about the family who gathered in Harrison Webb's office on that Saturday in March. My Aunt Patricia was 61. She had married a man named Gerald Chambers. Yes, same name as grandfather's father, which my grandmother had found quietly amusing, who was a commercial real estate developer in Columbus with a net worth that he discussed at Christmas dinner with the specific casualness of a man who had run out of other topics of conversation. They had a house in Upper Arlington worth approximately $1.3 million, a condo in Sarasota, and 2 adult children who had gone to private universities and were now doing fine in the specific way that meant fine enough that their parents' financial support had become optional rather than critical. Patricia had not worked since the early 1990s. She served on charity boards. She wore clothes that communicated wealth without saying the number out loud. My Uncle Douglas was 58. He had made money in technology in the 2000s, not Silicon Valley money, but Columbus tech money, which was still real money, and had parlayed it into a venture investment portfolio that he talked about at every family gathering regardless of whether the conversation had gone anywhere near the subject of investment. He lived in Dublin, Ohio, in a house with a 3-car garage, wore a watch that cost more than my annual salary, and had a habit of explaining things to people who had not asked to have things explained to them. My Uncle Richard was 56, the youngest of the 3 children. He had had a more complicated financial journey than his older siblings. 2 businesses that had not worked out, a divorce that had been expensive, a period in the mid-2010s where he had been quietly borrowing money from my grandfather that the rest of the family did not know about, and he had spent the last 10 years rebuilding, successfully enough that he now had a landscaping and property management company in Westerville that employed 40 people and was doing well. Richard was the most human of the 3, if I am being honest, not because he had failed more, but because the failing had worn some of the performance off of him. And then there was me. Ellie Harper, 29 years old, social worker at a nonprofit in Columbus that served families in crisis. Salary that covered my rent, my used car, my groceries, and the occasional dinner out without very much room between those things and the edge. No husband, no house, no investments, no portfolio to mention at dinner parties. A person who had chosen a career based on what she cared about rather than what it paid, and who was not sorry about this, and was also not going to pretend it, was financially irrelevant. I had been close to my grandfather in a way that my aunts and uncles had not been, not because they hadn't had the opportunity, because closeness of the specific kind my grandfather offered, the unhurried, patient, genuinely interested kind, required something in return that they had not found easy to provide, which was presence. My grandfather did not respond to performance. He responded to actual people. And the actual people he was closest to were the ones who had not confused him with an audience. I had visited him every other Sunday for 3 years. We had talked about books and his garden and my work and what he had been thinking about. He had taught me to make his coffee properly, which is to say improperly by any conventional standard but perfectly by his. He had told me stories about my grandmother Alina, who had passed in 2011, with the specific unperformed grief of someone for whom loss was real and ongoing and did not require an audience to be legitimate. I had not been visiting out of strategy. I had been visiting because he was my grandfather, and I loved him, and the Sundays with him were some of the best Sundays of my week. I did not know any of this would matter. I did not know any of this was going to be the most significant thing I had ever done. I found out on a Saturday in March in a lawyer's office in downtown Columbus, surrounded by my aunts and uncles and their spouses, when I was the only person in the room without a briefcase and the only person whose name they called last, and when what they placed in my hands was a small piece of paper that had been folded and creased and handled many times, and that made the people around me laugh before I had even opened it. Harrison Webb's office was on the 14th floor of a building on High Street in downtown Columbus that had the specific architecture of a building that had been expensive in 1987 and had maintained that quality through careful upkeep rather than renovation. Dark wood paneling, heavy furniture, the kind of carpet that communicated seriousness, a receptionist who said good morning without adding anything unnecessary. I arrived 5 minutes early in the best outfit I owned, which was a navy blazer over a cream blouse and dark pants, the combination I wore to job interviews and professional events and occasions that required me to look like I had thought about it. I had thought about it, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I respected the occasion. I was going to a meeting at which the last wishes of a man I loved were going to be read aloud, and that deserved consideration. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle Gerald arrived at the same time I did. Patricia's coat alone cost what I made in a week. She air-kissed my cheek and said, "Ellie, so good to see you in the tone people used when they were performing the version of themselves that showed up at funerals, and will readings and occasions that required the appearance of family unity." Gerald nodded at me, the way Gerald always nodded, which was with the precise minimum amount of acknowledgement required to technically constitute a greeting. Uncle Douglas arrived with his wife, Connie, a woman who had the quality of someone who had spent 20 years crafting a social persona and was now so inside it that she and the persona were functionally indistinguishable. Connie wore a cashmere wrap and had the kind of hair that required professional maintenance on a weekly basis. Douglas was in a suit that cost something. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, which was with the particular benign dismissal of someone for whom you occupied a category called fine, but not interesting. Uncle Richard came alone. His second wife had not come. Richard sat beside me without ceremony and said quietly, "How are you holding up?" which was the most human thing said to me in the first 10 minutes of being in that room. I said, "I'm okay. You," he said, "Not really." I appreciated that. Harrison Webb came in at exactly 10 o'clock. He was a man in his late 60s who had the specific quality of a lawyer who had been doing this work for a very long time and who had developed the ability to be neutral about almost everything while still being clearly present. He set a folder on the desk. He expressed brief condolences. He explained the process. The will was going to be read in sections. He would read each bequest in turn. He had envelopes and a few physical items to distribute. He asked that everyone hold questions until the reading was complete. The room settled. He began with the personal property. The Clintonville house, which my grandfather had owned outright for 20 years, went to all 3 children jointly with instructions for sale and equal division of proceeds. The furniture and household contents were to be divided by agreement among the 3 children with specific items designated to specific people. My grandmother Alina's jewelry, what remained of it, went to Patricia. A watch collection my grandfather had accumulated went to Richard. A set of first edition books went to Douglas, which I noticed he did not particularly react to, which told me he had expected something larger. Then Harrison Webb, opened a second section of the folder. He said, "The financial assets." The room became a specific kind of quiet. He described the first account, a brokerage account. He read the balance. I watched Patricia's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her husband Gerald's arm. The number was significant, 7 figures, the kind of number that makes a room go briefly still when it is read aloud. He described the second account, another brokerage account, differently structured, another 7-figure number, different category. He described the third, a real estate investment trust that my grandfather had held since 1978. The current value made Douglas put down the pen he had been holding. The pen made a small sound on the wooden table. Nobody moved. He described the fourth, a private equity holding from the early 1990s that had appreciated over 30 years in the way that well-chosen long-term positions appreciated, quietly and enormously. I watched Richard's face do something complicated. Richard, who had borrowed money from our grandfather in difficult years and who now understood, I think for the first time, what that money had actually come from. The total financial assets were significant in a way that I want to be careful about describing precisely, because the exact numbers are private, and because numbers were not the point. The point was that the family that had spent 30 years assuming they understood Walter Harper's financial situation had been operating with a fundamentally incorrect picture. The quiet, steady man with the strong coffee and the battered garden gloves had been building something for 58 years that none of them had known to ask about. Harrison Webb read the distribution of the financial assets. 1/3 to Patricia, 1/3 to Douglas, 1/3 to Richard. The relief in the room was almost audible, the specific exhale of people who had been told they were getting what they had come for. Then Harrison Webb said, "There is one additional bequest." He reached into the folder, and he took out something that was clearly not an envelope from a law firm. It was a piece of paper, folded multiple times, slightly worn at the creases in the way of something that had been folded and unfolded many times. The paper had visible handling on it, the kind of handling that accumulated over time, the kind that came from being taken out and looked at and put away again repeatedly over months or years. He said, "This is designated to Alina Grace Harper, Ellie. Mr. Harper was specific that this was to be handed to her directly and that she was to open it herself in the presence of the family." He handed it to me. I felt the paper in my hands. It was lighter than I expected. Or maybe it just felt light because of what it was being compared to, the 7-figure accounts, the 30-year equity positions, the brokerage balances that had made Patricia's hand tighten and Douglas's pen drop. Patricia said, "What is it?" Harrison Webb said, "Ms. Harper will open it." I looked at the paper in my hands. I looked at the creases. I looked at the handling marks. I thought about my grandfather sitting somewhere, his armchair, his kitchen table, maybe out in the garden, taking this piece of paper out and looking at it and folding it back up. I thought about what that meant, about how many times he had done it, about what he was thinking when he did. Douglas made a sound that was somewhere between a polite cough and a smirk. He said, "A piece of paper." He said it quietly, but not quietly enough. Patricia's husband Gerald said, "I suppose that's well." Patricia said, "Ellie's sweetheart, it's fine. It's probably a letter, something sentimental." The word sentimental in the specific way she said it communicated a complete sentence. The sentence was, "This is the consolation prize for the grandchild who got nothing real, and we are being gracious about it." Richard said nothing. He was looking at the paper with an expression I couldn't fully read. I heard Douglas make another sound. Not quite a laugh, the cousin of a laugh. The specific noise that people make when they have already decided the situation is beneath their attention and are performing the tolerance of not saying so. I heard Patricia say something quietly to Gerald that included the words "always been like that" about Ellie and Daddy, which told me that whatever she was saying was about my relationship with my grandfather, and the fact that it had not been invisible even if it had been, apparently, something she felt a certain way about. The room had the quality of a room that is waiting for a formality to be concluded. I looked at the paper. I unfolded it. I want to tell you what was on the paper. But first, I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my grandfather approximately 2 years before he passed, because the conversation was the context without which the paper made less sense. It was a Sunday in January. I had driven to Clintonville in the kind of Ohio January, whether that was gray and cold, and made you understand viscerally why people in Columbus drank so much coffee. I had brought a book I thought he'd like, a history of early 20th century American business that a colleague had recommended, and that I had read quickly and thought of him immediately. He had been in his kitchen when I arrived, making the too strong coffee, and we had moved to the sitting room where he had his armchair, and I had the chair beside the bookshelf that I had occupied so many times over so many years that I thought of it privately as my chair. We had talked for a while about the book I had brought. He had a response to everything in the first 3 chapters that told me he had already read most of what was in it from primary sources over the years. He always had. He was the kind of reader who read to understand rather than to have read. Then he said, "Can I show you something?" I said yes. He went to the small desk in the corner of the sitting room, the one where he kept the things he was currently working on or thinking about, the one that I had never been invited to look at in any formal sense, but that I had glanced at over the years and seen the specific ordered arrangement of a person who processed information through physical organization. He opened the center drawer. He took out a piece of paper that had been folded multiple times. He came back and sat in his armchair, and he unfolded the paper on his knee. He said, "I've been working on something for a while. I want to show it to you because I think you're the one who will understand why I did it this way." I looked at the paper. It was dense with handwriting. His handwriting, which was the specific handwriting of someone who had learned in an era when penmanship was taught seriously, neat, deliberate, slightly old-fashioned. It covered both sides of the paper in columns and paragraphs and what appeared to be numerical notations. He said, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "No." He said, "It's a map." I looked at him. He said, "Not a literal map. A map of something I've been building for 58 years that nobody in this family has ever thought to ask about. Not because they don't care about money, they care a great deal about money. But because they assumed they already understood my financial situation based on what they could see. The house, the car, the clothes. Nobody looked past the surface to ask what might be underneath it." He refolded the paper. He held it for a moment. He said, "I have been thinking about what to do with it. Not the money. I know what to do with the money. The law handles that, and Harrison knows what I want. I mean the knowledge, the map, the understanding of how something gets built and what it takes and why patience matters more than almost anything else when you're building it." He looked at me. He said, "I've thought about who in this family would understand why I'm giving it to them rather than just handing them something, and I keep coming back to you." I said, "Grandpa." He said, "Not because you need the money the most, though you probably do. Not because I love you more, though I love you very much. Because you're the one who would actually read it. You're the one who would understand what it means. Everyone else would look at this piece of paper and see a piece of paper. You would look at it and see the 58 years. I said, "What is on it?" He smiled. He said, "Everything I know about building something that lasts. In the specific language of what I actually did, not what I wish I had done or what sounds good in theory. The actual decisions, the actual reasoning, the actual mistakes, all of it." He refolded it and put it back in the drawer. He said, "It'll be yours after I'm gone, not instead of anything. It is the thing. The other things are just the results." I said, "Grandpa, I don't understand." He said, "You will." He was right. I didn't fully understand until I was sitting in Harrison Webb's office on a Saturday in March with a worn, folded piece of paper in my hands and Patricia's, husband making sounds next to me, and Douglas's pen sitting silent on the table. When I unfolded the paper in that conference room, I saw my grandfather's handwriting. Dense, deliberate, covering both sides. Columns and paragraphs and notations. And at the top, in slightly larger letters than the rest, a heading that read, "For Ellie, what I actually did and why, and what it can do for you if you let it." I read the first paragraph. It said, "I've been watching you since you were 7 years old, sitting in my kitchen trying to figure out reading, while your cousins ran around outside wanting to play. I've watched you choose hard things over easy ones your whole life. I've watched you become someone who knows what she cares about and goes toward it regardless of what it pays or what it looks like from the outside. This piece of paper is for that person, not for the version of you that anyone else sees. For you." I stopped reading. Not because there wasn't more, because I needed a moment. I set the paper flat on the table. And then I let them see what was on it. Not all of it, not the personal parts. The part that made every face in that room lose its color. I turned the paper slightly so the writing was visible to the people on either side of me, and what they saw was not a letter, not a sentimental note, not a piece of paper with feelings on it. They saw columns of numbers, investment positions, account references, property holdings, holdings that had not been mentioned in the will because they were not being distributed through the will. And at the bottom of the first column, circled once in blue pen, a notation that read, "Living Trust, EGH, established 2019, Harrison Webb trustee." Patricia said, "What is that?" Harrison Webb, who had been watching the room quietly, said, "Ms. Harper, perhaps we should discuss the trust documentation separately." Douglas said, "What trust?" Harrison said, "Mr. Harper established a living trust in 2019 with Ms. Alina Grace Harper as sole beneficiary. The assets within the trust were not subject to probate and are therefore not part of today's will reading. I can discuss the details with Ms. Harper privately." The room went the kind of quiet that was different from all the previous quiet. I looked at the piece of paper in my hands. I looked at my grandfather's handwriting. I thought about 2 years ago in the sitting room and what he had said about the map and about who would understand why he was giving it. Then I looked up. Patricia's face had a color I had never seen on it before. Douglas had picked up his pen but was not writing anything. Richard was looking at me with the complicated expression from before, except now it was clearer, and what it was something that looked like it might actually be respect. I said, "I think I'll take Harrison up on that." I folded the paper. I put it in my blazer pocket. And I waited for the room to reorganize itself around the new information, which it did, in the specific slow, lurching way that rooms reorganized when the story everyone had agreed on turned out to be wrong. Harrison Webb's private office was smaller than the conference room and had a window that looked out over High Street and a small table with 2 chairs where he gestured for me to sit while he went around to his desk. He set another folder on the table. This one was thicker than the first. He said, "Your grandfather was a thorough man." I said, "I know." He said, "He established the trust in 2019. He had been planning it for longer than that, I believe, but the formal establishment was 2019. He named you as sole beneficiary, with me as trustee until such time as you choose to assume management, which you may do at any point." He paused. He spent considerable time deciding how to structure it. We had many conversations about it. I said, "What's in it?" He opened the folder. What Harrison Webb laid out for me over the next 45 minutes was the full picture of what my grandfather had built over 58 years of quiet, patient, consistent investment. The picture that had never been visible from the outside, because he had never made a production of it. The picture that his own children had not known to ask about because they had never looked past the sensible car and the worn garden gloves and the too strong coffee. The trust contained a real estate portfolio that my grandfather had been building since 1972. Not glamorous properties, practical ones. Residential properties in Columbus neighborhoods he had watched carefully and bought carefully and maintained carefully and held for decades while their values did what well-chosen Columbus real estate did over 50 years, which was increase substantially and consistently. 7 properties in total, all paid off. All generating rental income that had been flowing into the trust accounts for years. The trust contained an investment account that was the result of 58 years of what Harrison Webb described as disciplined, research-based long-term investing. My grandfather had never chased trends. He had bought things he understood, held them through the fluctuations that made other investors panic and sell, and let time do what time did to well-chosen investments. The account balance was something that I read 3 times on the Page Harrison web placed in front of me. The trust also contained something I had not known about at all, which was a minority stake in a regional manufacturing company that my grandfather had purchased in 1986 when the company was struggling, and its founder, a man he had worked with at Meridian, had needed a private investor. The company had recovered. The company had grown. The company was now not a small regional manufacturer anymore. The stake, 30 years later, was worth something that changed the entire picture of the document I was holding. The total was, and I will not give you the exact number because the exact number is private, significant in a way that made the financial assets distributed to Patricia and Douglas, and Richard, in the will reading, represent approximately a third of the total picture rather than the whole picture. Walter Harper had quietly and deliberately separated what he was leaving to his children from what he was leaving to me. And he had done it in a way that was completely legal, completely documented, completely structured by a lawyer who had been working with him for 15 years, and completely invisible until the moment I placed the piece of paper on the conference table. Harrison said, "He wanted you to have the knowledge first. That's why the paper was given to you in front of the family rather than privately. He was specific about that." I said, "Why?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me, and I am quoting as closely as I can. He said he had watched the people in his family treat wealth as something you displayed rather than something you built. He said he had watched them assume they understood what he had because they could see the parts he let them see. He wanted the last thing they understood about him to be the thing he had built in the space they had never bothered to look, not as a punishment, as a lesson." I sat with that. I said, "He wasn't trying to humiliate anyone." Harrison said, "No, he was trying to show them something they should have already known, about patience, about not assuming you understand something just because you can see the surface of it, about the value of the people in your life who actually pay attention." He slid a final document across the table. He said, "He also wrote you a letter, a longer one. This one is just for you, not to be shared. He asked me to give it to you privately." I took the envelope. I held it. Harrison said, "You don't have to read it here." I said, "I know." I put it in my blazer pocket, next to the crumpled piece of paper. I looked out the window at High Street. The Columbus afternoon was gray and ordinary and exactly itself. People walked on the sidewalk below going wherever they were going without knowing what had just happened in this building. The city continued being the city. I thought about Sundays in Clintonville. I thought about Too Strong coffee. I thought about my grandfather's hands, always slightly rough from the garden, and the way he bent the corners of pages he wanted to find again, and the way he laughed with his whole body at things that actually deserved laughter. I thought about the 17-year-old version of me who had started visiting him on Sundays, not because anyone had suggested it, and not because I had any strategy about it, but because I genuinely loved being there, and the Sundays were good, and the conversations were real, and he was my favorite person. I thought about the version of those Sundays that my family had observed and filed under the category of Ellie and Grandpa. That's always been their thing. They had been right that it was our thing. They had been wrong about what the thing was. The 3 months after the will reading were strange in the specific way that life became strange when it shifted significantly, and the people around you were trying to figure out what the shift meant for them. Patricia called me the Monday after the reading. Her voice had the specific quality of a woman who had rehearsed the call before making it. She said, "Ellie, I hope you know we are so happy for you." The emphasis on happy was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She said she hoped we could have lunch soon and catch up properly, and that family was family through everything. I said, "Sure, Aunt Patricia, that sounds nice." I did not confirm a date. Douglas sent me an email that was 3 paragraphs long and included, in the second paragraph, a mention of his investment portfolio and the contacts he had in Columbus financial circles, and that he would be happy to make some introductions if I was looking for guidance on managing a more complex financial situation. The email was generous in the specific way that people are generous when they have recalibrated their assessment of you and are working out how to position themselves in the new arrangement. I replied with 5 sentences. I thanked him. I said I was working with Harrison Webb and felt well supported. I said I would be in touch. Richard called me the same evening Patricia did. He did not rehearse the call. He said, "Ellie, I don't know what to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything." He said, "I knew he thought the world of you, I knew it. I just didn't know he had been doing all of this quietly for so long." I said, "Neither did I," he said. "He was something else, wasn't he?" I said, "Yeah, he really was." That call lasted 45 minutes and was the most real conversation I'd had with a family member in years. I read the letter in my apartment on Sunday evening, a week after the reading. I made coffee in the way my grandfather had taught me, too strong and without complaint, and I sat at my kitchen table and I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten in the same deliberate penmanship as the piece of paper that had been handed to me in the conference room. I am not going to share what he wrote. Some things are private in the specific way that means they belong to the person they were written for, and sharing them would be a kind of reduction rather than a kind of sharing. What I can tell you is that he explained the trust, not the legal mechanics, which Harrison had covered, but the thinking, the 58 years of thinking that had produced it. He wrote about what he had learned about money and what he had learned about people, and what he had observed in his own family over decades that had shaped the decisions he made about how to leave what he had built. He wrote that he had not built the trust to punish anyone. He wrote that he loved his children and that the distribution in the will was real and genuine and enough for anyone to do well with if they chose to be thoughtful about it. He wrote that what he had given them was what they needed, and what he had given me was what I needed, which was different and not less. He wrote about the Sundays. He wrote that those Sundays had meant more to him than he had been able to tell me while he was living, not because he lacked the words, but because saying it while he was there would have changed the quality of what the Sundays were. He said the Sundays were good because they were free, because I had come without agenda, because the conversations were real because neither of us needed anything from them except the conversation itself. He said that was the rarest thing he had encountered in the second half of his life, and he had wanted me to know it. He wrote about patience. He wrote several paragraphs about patience that I have read many times since, and that have changed how I move through my days in ways that are hard to describe quickly. He wrote that the most important thing he had learned in 58 years of building anything, investments, relationships, a life, was that patience was not the same as waiting. Waiting was passive. Patience was active. Patience was continuing to make the right decisions consistently over time, even when the results were not visible yet, and even when the people around you had concluded based on surface appearances that you had nothing much going on. He wrote that he had watched me be patient in exactly that way for my whole life. He wrote that he hoped what he was leaving me would let the results of that patience become visible in the way they deserved to be. At the bottom of the last page, he had written, in slightly larger letters than the rest, 1 sentence. "The people who laughed at the crumpled paper are the lesson. You are the future. Love, Grandpa." I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I held the envelope for a while without doing anything else. Then I made a second cup of coffee, too strong, without complaining, and I started thinking about what I was going to do. Here is what I have done in the 6 months since. I did not quit my job. I want to say that clearly because I think it's the part of the story that surprises people the most. I am still a social worker at the same nonprofit in Columbus serving families in crisis. I still love my work. I still believe in what we do. And now, for the first time, I have the ability to support that work in a way that goes beyond my own labor. I established a fund through the nonprofit. Not in my name. In my grandmother Aliner's name. The Aliner Grace Harper Family Support Fund. It provides emergency housing assistance and crisis support resources to families that the nonprofit serves. The fund has, in its first 6 months, helped 37 families stabilize in situations that without the fund would have resulted in outcomes that the work of prevention is designed to prevent. I hired a property manager for the real estate portfolio because property management was not my skill set, and my grandfather's notes on the subject were clear that the right expertise at the right time was worth the cost. The properties are being well maintained and are generating the income they were designed to generate. I have had multiple conversations with Harrison Webb about the longer-term structure of everything and about what my grandfather's investment philosophy actually looked like in practice, and about how to apply the principles he documented on the crumpled piece of paper to my own decision-making going forward. I moved to a slightly larger apartment, not a dramatically larger one that has 2 windows instead of one, including one that faces a tree instead of a brick wall, and a radiator that is slightly less vocal about its opinions. I have not bought a new car yet because the cracked side mirror has not become a safety issue, and because I am, apparently, my grandfather's grandchild. Patricia and I had lunch in May. It was polite. It was warmer than I expected, which I believe was genuine rather than strategic, and I gave it the benefit of the doubt because I am trying to be the kind of person who gives benefits of doubts where they are reasonably available. We have not had lunch again yet, but we have exchanged a few text messages, and they have felt more honest than our communications usually felt, which I consider progress. Douglas sent me a book in April, a business book, one he said had influenced his thinking significantly. No inscription, just the book with a post-it note that said, "Thought you might like this." I read it. It was pretty good. I have not told him that yet, but I probably will. Richard and I have dinner once a month. We have become, in the past 6 months, the closest thing to actual friends that 2 members of our family have ever been to each other. He talks about his business. I talk about my work. We talk about our grandfather. We remember specific things and tell each other the stories, and sometimes one of us will say something that makes the other one laugh the way our grandfather laughed, with our whole body at things that actually deserve it. Last month, Richard told me something that has stayed with me. He said, "I've been thinking about the way we all talked about Grandpa, like he was, I don't know, simple, I guess. Like he was just a steady, quiet old man who worked his whole life and retired and gardened. And I think I confused simple with transparent. He was transparent about the things he chose to be transparent about. Everything else he just kept building, in the space we weren't paying attention to." I said, "That sounds like him." Richard said, "Yeah." He thought for a moment. "I think he was the most interesting person any of us ever knew, and we kind of missed it because he didn't remind us of it constantly." I said, "He really didn't." Richard said, "What was in the letter?" I said, "Private." He smiled. He said, "Fair enough." My name is Ellie Harper. I'm 29 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio. My grandfather is gone, and the specific shape of that absence is something I am still learning to live with and expect I will be learning to live with for a long time. The Sundays are quiet in a way they were not before. The too strong coffee tastes different when you make it alone. The armchair in his sitting room, which now lives in my apartment because Richard and I agreed it was the right place for it, is the piece of furniture I look at most when I'm thinking about something difficult. The crumpled piece of paper lives in the small box on my bookshelf, where I keep the things that matter most to me. The envelope is in there too, and a photograph of my grandfather in his garden, and the bent corner book he was reading the last Sunday I visited him. Every few months I take the piece of paper out and read it again. Not because I need to, because it still teaches me something different each time, which tells me that the understanding of it is still catching up to itself, the way understanding usually does when the thing being understood is larger than what you expected. Here is what I want to leave you with before this story ends. My grandfather did not leave me the trust to make a point to anyone. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be easy to hear this story and conclude that the ending was about one-upping the people who laughed at the crumpled paper. It was not. The trust was not designed as a countermove. It was designed as a gift. A genuine, specific, deeply personal gift from a man who had spent years thinking about what I actually needed, and what would actually serve me and how to give it to me in a way that honored what our relationship had actually been. The lesson, if there is a lesson, is not about revenge. The lesson is about attention. My grandfather paid attention to his investments and built something significant because he was patient and consistent and never tried to make the building look more impressive from the outside than it actually was. He paid attention to the people around him, to which ones actually showed up, to which ones were present rather than performing, and he responded to what he actually saw rather than to the surface version of what was in front of him. He paid attention to me. He saw who I actually was, not who I appeared to be from the outside, not the small apartment and the cracked car mirror and the nonprofit salary, but who I actually was, which was a person who loved him honestly and consistently, and without agenda, and who chose real things over impressive-looking things, because that was how I was built. And he responded to what he actually saw. He responded with a crumpled piece of paper. That piece of paper was not consolation. It was everything. If you are the person in your family who gets overlooked, who doesn't have the impressive house or the loud career or the right kind of life that makes people at family dinners take you seriously, I want to say something to you before we end. The people who don't look at you don't know what you're building, and the building is not less real because it's not visible from where they're standing. Keep building. Pay attention. Be the person who actually shows up. Because somewhere in your life, there is a Walter Harper who notices those things, who sees who you actually are and not who you appear to be, and what they are building in the space you can't see yet may be more than you ever expected. You just have to be the person worth leaving it to. Like this video if Grandpa Walter's story hit something real in you today. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about the people in our lives who mattered more than we realized until we lost them. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet people build the most impressive things. Ring that bell so you're here every time we come back. And take care of yourselves. See you next time.